Greetings once again, and we are here. This is the Gracious Hope Live Podcast. We are here every Saturday, this time to bring you this podcast. And the platform of this podcast is all about contemporary issues that affect the Christian life of faith. And we are focusing on Liberia. And this is all about promoting and preserving our Christian heritage as well as our cultural and social heritage. My name is Alexander Ray, your host, and Reverend Suah Deddeh is also here as the co-host of this podcast today. We encourage you to opine, make all of your comments in the section below, and also click that share button and have this program shared with your friends, your families, and loved ones. And today we'll be looking at the late 1970s and the early 1980s, where Liberia witnessed tumultuous time marked by intense social political upheaval and the clamor for political change by the Liberian progressives. Now, the Liberian progressives were spearheaded by a complex mix of motivations and actions, and this movement brought to the fore long-standing issues such as economic inequality, political exclusion, social injustice, and the demand for democracy. And as we see here on our podcast, we will look deeper into the motivations and actions of the Liberian progressives, as well as the profound aftermaths that reshape Liberia's political landscape. So please join us as we unravel this pivotal moment in Liberian history and explore its mixed legacy. And today, as our special guest, we have Mr. John Lloyd, who formerly served as the president of the Liberian community in the Washington, D.C., Maryland metro area. He's our guest today. And he's also a founding member of the Association of Liberian Journalists in the Americas, Alger. He's currently on his way to be on this program as our special guest. So please sit back and relax as we discuss this very important historical event in our country's history, or our country's heritage, may I say. And as we go through the discussion, we ask that you share what you know during those moments when you were either young or older, and you can remember what went on at the time from the 70s through the 80s. And we will be just solving the Tolbert and the progressives, their agitation of going back and forth about multi democracy environment or society. And that's what we'll be exploring today. And so, once again, welcome. And the co-host of this program is Reverend Suah S. Deddeh. He's also here as well. Reverend Deddeh, it is a very nice day out here today, and I, pray that it's going to stay like this until we get through to the summertime, because spring is unpredictable in the United States.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. And that's why I always say this is the day that the Lord has made, because we can rejoice and will rejoice and should rejoice on any condition, on any weather or situation. So we are blessed to be back today on this podcast. It's always a good thing when you and I can meet and discuss about our country, the politics, and social, economic, and just think about it. Because and somebody asked me the other day, Pastor Deddeh, why are you going back into history? Why are you opening old wounds? And I laughed and said, history teaches us for the future. And that is why you always go back to historicity, so that you don't make the same mistake that occurred in the past. Now, the purpose that we are discussing, even the Bible talks about that, our visit the iniquities of the parents on the third and fourth generation. I mean, a history taking place there. So to now repeat the mistakes of the past, to build our integrity and our continuity, it is always good to revisit history, to look at the good and the bad, so that you can maybe build up on the good and try to avoid the bad. That's why we are having this discussion. And there's going to be an ongoing discussion, because we need to have it for our country. The young generation may have heard about what happened, but I don't think they have a deep knowledge of what happened in the past. Some of the young people we have right now, they were the 80s born. Okay, they grew up in those conflict in the 1990s was even worse. So that's why, to answer that question to the general public, that's why we are going into history, so that we don't go back to where we came from. We don't make the same mistakes. Having said that, we will discuss a lot of things today that we can cover, because we see this program going to be the podcast going to be more than one shot podcast. So we intend to do the best we can. Look at how we came to this place, what caused us to come to this place, and how we should not do anything else to bring us back to this place. At least that's why we are here today. And the guest we have, he's a former Liberian journalist as well, like you and myself. And he has, I would say he knows everything, but he has an understanding of what happened in the past, and that's why he's our special guest today, Ellis. So welcome. How are you today? My side is good. The weather is fine, but I was just outside trying to take a walk. Pleasant weather outside. Yeah. But you say your weather is fine from your end, right?
Yeah. All is well here. All is well, and I'm hoping our guest will come to share his knowledge with us, so that we can unravel a pivotal moment in Liberian history, and also to look deep into all of what happened. As we all know, the progressives are they were young people, young, some older, and the country, the feeling at the time, people wanted change. They wanted to see things change after long years of rule by just one political party. So the Liberian progressives, they were clamoring for political change during President William R. Tolbert's administration, and that is started from in the late 70s and early 80s, and that was a very significant chapter in Liberia's history, reflecting a period of intense social political time. And so this movement, the progressives, the progressives were driven by a complex of a mix of motivations and actions resulting in the aftermath that we see today. And so our country is reshaped because you can allude to the 70s and the 80s. However, some might go, historians might go, further back about how everything unfolded and accumulated to or culminated into the 1980 coup in which President Tolbert was assassinated. But if we look at all of those years, we saw the economic disparities going on under his administration. On the top of that is Tolbert administration. According to history, there were economic growth. He wanted to bring some change or make change some things, but the benefits of the economic growth, the benefits were unevenly distributed. And so, with a significant portion of wealth concentrated among the American Liberian elites, what's a problem? It was a problem. So, this economic inequality necessitated the resentment among the indigenous populations and those not part of that elite system. So then the True Party, which of course had been in power for over a century, was heavily dominated. And so because of that, we see the tension rising up. And on top of that was also the political exclusion, which of course it was the lack of political pluralism and marginalization of the indigenous Liberians from political power. Those were all grievances, brewing, and the issue of social justice, like I said from the introduction. And so this is just, a summary of some things that culminated into the event of the arrest riot and eventually the assassination. And we are hoping our guests will come in soon in a few minutes to expound on some of his experiences as not as a husband or father or journalist, but his dad, the late Edwin Lloyd Sr., had a lot of he had a knowledge about those events, and I believe he must have passed them over to his children, including Mr. John Lloyd, who will be our guest today. So we are hoping to get a lot of understanding from him during that time, because people have various testimony regarding the years of from 70s through the 80s. However, we know just one common event, the big one that happened, but there are some other issues or problems in between those years that we would like to also explore. Reverend Deddeh.
Yes, historians have argued that a series of complex events led to the coup of 1980. The first of which was the imbalance of power between the native population of Liberia and the American Liberians. The American Liberians were descendants, as you know, from African American, a majority of Afro-Caribbean settlers, some of whom were free slaves and their descendants who immigrated to Liberia with the assistance from the American Colonization Society. So the American Liberian settlers did not relate well to the indigenous, according to history, did not relate well to the indigenous peoples. They encounter, and the following time they had a declaration of independence in 1846.
Well, you faded in a little bit here.
Well, maybe
okay.
I'm here.
There you go.
I'm here.
There you go.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
that's my internet. Yeah, that's my internet. The American Liberian settlers, like I said, did not relate well to the indigenous people. The encounter, and following the Liberian Declaration of Independence in 1847, they held an elite position over society, while the native tribes lived within poorly developed communities and rural communities in Liberia. So over time, the two communities start to integrate and intermingle. But in the decades prior to the coup, American Liberians still control much of Liberia's political institutions, despite making up a smaller percentage of the total ethnic population and
Mhm.
were reluctant to cede power to the natives at the time. So a majority of the Liberian presidents were of American Liberian descent and belonged to the True Party, as you mentioned. So while opposition parties were never banned, the True Party effectively, at least, governed the country as a one-party state, which is true. So although Liberia saw a period of economic prosperity, like you mentioned again, in the 1960s, and rapid development, there was still a disparity between the American Liberians and the natives. That's history. So after coming to power in 1971, at least President Tolbert sought to address imbalances and introduce liberal reforms. You also talk about about that, including recognizing opposition groups. However, Alex, Toba was also accused of using nepotism and corruption to retain power, which fueled opposition to the government. We're trying to go back to history to see what happens that we don't repeat the same thing. So Toba's administration also introduced unpopular agricultural reforms, which were opposed by many sections of Liberian society and led to the Rest Riot, which you mentioned in 1979. So following the riots, Alex, and the Maryland ritualistic killing, all those things compounded Toba call for the imprisonment of opposition leaders. That helped to lead us to the April 1980 coup. So in the early hours of April 20, 1980, 17 non-enlisted officers, at least, and soldiers of the armed forces of Liberia, led by Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, launched the violent coup d'etat. All of the conspirators were indigenous Liberians, while Toba belonged to the American Liberian settlers group. So the group
Mhm.
entered there's we have different stories of how this group entered the executive marshal, but that's just a little backdrop of how we came to this place, the imbalances and what the president did. But nevertheless, the president has some good plans and for Liberia, but you still have opposition in its own rank and file. Because some people thought you were going too fast with the reforms they wanted to do, and the progressives thought you were going a little slower. So that talk for himself between the sisters, at least. And that's just a backdrop of how we came to the 1980 coup.
Yeah, 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 and it is a familiar story that is being told about that particular assassination event, and it is one of the most brutal way to look at our history and look at the president, the head of a country, assassinated for the sake of making things right or for political correctness. And everything that we're talking about, they named things like corruption, widespread perceptions of social injustice within the Taliban administration and the ruling elite. And so those that came together and they were yearning for change, political change, like we said, the progressives, they were particularly concerned about the government's failure to address the needs of the poor segments of society. Now, there can be a debate on that too, because there are some people who work in the Taliban administration who will say, well, Tolbert initiated the higher heights proposition or policy, and he incorporated a lot of things that he was doing for the native people, like in the inner part of the country, the interior part of the country. Some people will argue that he was doing well. He was trying to bring up a change, but the progressives, or those that were yearning for change, wanted more and more. They wanted it right away. They wanted democracy right away. There was that demand for democracy, and so the progressives strongly desire more democratic governance, including implementing multi-party democracy, freedom of speech, and greater civil liberties. And so they wanted the government to take action right away. And so in the background, there was this political mobilization going on, and the progressives mobilized support through student groups, intellectuals, and political organizations such as the Movement for Justice in Africa, MOJA, and the Progressive Alliance of Liberia called PAL, So Moja and Powell and others, these groups, they were very critical in organizing protests and discussions and advocating for political reforms. And public protests was nothing but a series of demonstrations against the government, the Taliban government, mainly focusing on economic inequality and political exclusion. And we can see that in the event of the April 14, 1979 rice riot, triggered by a proposed increase in prices, and it turned violent later on. And there was an international report, local report, about the escalation of the conflict between the protesters and the government and those that were critics. And so a lot of other things, that occur in between the 70s and the 80s, or this 1979 with the rice riot, and then the 1980, in 1980, when the assassination took place. We're still waiting for our guests here. So if you're just joining us, we'd like to say this is the Gracious Hope Live podcast. And today we are talking about President Tolbert and the progressives. Now, if some of you were very young at the time, they didn't remember what went on. For some of you that were born later on, like in the 90s, or the 2000s, you can ask questions. You can write your comments or things you've learned in the school, or things you learned from your parents, because I know parents will tell the story about what went on, like the Civil War. I was part of the Civil War. I was there when the Civil War started, and it subsided before leaving. So I can tell others about what happened because I was an eyewitness to what happened. And so that those years, it was a tumultuous time for the country, and there was this advocacy and awareness. And then the progressives, they also spread awareness through newspapers and pamphlets and public speeches, criticizing the government's policies and advocating for change. So that change, it was a change that that message resonated with the majority population, because they wanted to see a change in the status quo. But as we learned later on, we see what a change brought, right? They wanted to change because they wanted change to take place because they wanted freedom of speech, economic equality, um, and other amenities or resources of the country. They wanted them distributed evenly, and not only between like the small elite group of people. And so those that were advocating for change, their messages resonated with the population, and those formation of student groups and other groups that were interested, yes, they were voicing up. They were voicing up. And then the coup came, the coup and assassination. And that, of course, brought tension. Okay. And the tension culminated into that military coup on April 12th, 1980, which was led by Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, as history would say. It was led by him, but it was 17 men, right? That carry on that according to history. So we are quoting from the history. We're living at the time in Liberia, but we were not on the scene. We only hear from sources, from books and stories that parents, tell, as well as other good evidence that we also see, not through books, but through other means. And so um, as we wait for our guests here, we would like to take a short break, okay? And we'll be right back. Please don't go away. And please share your comments. Anything you know, please help us out here, okay? You might know a whole lot out there too. And you can also share with us, okay? And for all those who are watching from our homeland, Liberia, Phoebe Airstrip, Swakoko District, Bon County, and we have Mamadou said, very good. Yeah, these are things we like to talk to make sure that we create awareness. Riverset Pro. Um, thank you for joining us. And so we'll be right back here. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Please stay, okay? Please hold on. Our guest is already here, and we'll be right back. Please hold. All right, welcome back here. This is the Gracious Hope Live podcast, and we are talking about President Tolbert and the progressives, all that went on. And we are so glad to have our special guest here, Mr. John Lloyd, who has vast experience as a journalist and also as former president of the Liberian community in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And he's a co-founder of the Association of Liberian Journalists in America. He was former vice president of ALJA. And so, with pleasure, we'd like to welcome him right now. Welcome, Mr. Lloyd. Welcome to the podcast, and we are glad to see you.
Oh, glad to see you both, Alex and my brother Suah. I know we all go way back, and all brothers of the pen. It's a wonderful opportunity. I regret, being a few minutes late, but it's better late than never.
Exactly. And our guest, our guest is here once again, and our watching audience clamoring to hear from you. Now, we're talking about the 70s and the 80s, all of what went on to shape the history of our country political landscape. And that's what we're talking about. Now, what are some of the remembrance, or what are some of the things that you believe you can share with our watching audience right now regarding the causes or things that necessitated the 1980 upheaval, which of course is a coup, and the progressives and the agitation between the progressives and the Tolbert administration, some of the changes that were demanded. What is your take?
Okay, well, on the surface, we've heard the constant summary of the events of 1980, which focused mainly on, in most narrative, we will hear about the riot of 1979, when progressives got together to demand the reduction of the price of rice from of the Tolbert government at the time. And Tolbert government, from an economic standpoint, was trying to get Liberia, like most African countries at the time, through the process of self-sufficiency in food production. You can't have self-sufficiency if you depend on imported rice and subsidized rice through the PL 480 program that existed at the time. So Tolbert had that mat-to-mattress program where he built estates to get people all, huts and these, thatch houses that we have in the town. And he built, Cabral Estate, Stephen Tolbert Estate, Barnesville Estate, and all these estates, and give it to people as low as $35 a month just to get people in affordable housing. He had the LPMC, and all the different agriculture projects, DC at DP, LC at DP, all combined into the LPMC to make sure that people go into farming and make money through farming as an incentive, to get the country towards self-sufficiency in food production. From the political side, it was exploited by the progressives, as an easy political propaganda. And, a lot of people point fingers at the progressive, but in politics, people take chances and they take opportunities, like even in the market, you see an opportunity in propaganda, you exploit that in order to gain ground, for political advantage. So what they did, they used the right situation, to gain the attention of the public and say, look, we can offer rice at $9 a month. And, Tolbert himself has farms. His family has farms, through Meserata Group of companies. So therefore, they stand to economically benefit if they force people to buy, local rice instead of the imported rice. So it was framed that way to the public. And, there was mobilization on April 14 happened. April 14 happened. It was a devastating, blow to the government. Tolbert was in, at the final stage of planning for, this big event of the OAU conference of 1979, where he became chairman of the OAU. A lot of development activities had occurred in Liberia. Tubman Boulevard has been expanded from 2 lanes to 4 lanes with street lights going all the way to Robertsfield. LBS had programming, from 7 o'clock in the evening throughout the day. You could wake up in the morning and watch Good Times on your color television. So Liberia was revolutionizing, and getting very modern at that time. He invested a lot of money into the OAU. And then all of a sudden in April, a few months before July, when the conference was held, this explosion of, April 14, and streets got damaged. There was looting of property, and I think an estimated $2, $3, $4 million worth of damage occurred, where the government had to pay back businesses to get them back in force. But that precipitated something that would happen 12 months later. But people focus a lot on the agitation of April 14 and the progressive, alliances, PAL, Moja, and the rest of them, the propaganda they had, about the privileges being given to descendants of the settlers versus, disadvantages that were meted out to the indigenous Liberians, which absolutely is true. Those differences, those social differences, social economic differences did occur. But at the same time, too, if we look at things historically, we do expect that in any nation where you have people founding the nation, they will have an economic advantage over those who didn't have, that beginning, opportunity that they had. But, all in all, at the stage where we were in 1979, Tolbert had gone a long way from what Tubman did. The government had majority of the government officials in higher level, of indigenous background at that time, similar, as opposed to in the 60s. By 1979, you had cabinet ministers from all different ethnic backgrounds at that time. Tolbert made big moves towards bringing young people into the fore. You had Emmanuel Bouya, who was the general coordinator of the Chewy Party, a guy from Grand Bass. Particularly from Riverside County, and he had a whole lot of people, Choho Pakahai and all these people, in various high positions. And even those who carried, the Western names, beneath those names, they were actually indigenous folks. Folks would tell you about, people like Harry Greaves, who was Minister of Defense, Harry Greaves Sr. He was 100% indigenous. He just lived with people who had the name that he carried. I heard Reginald Townsend even came from the Mamba Bassa background. So and a lot of other people that that were associated with Chewy Party government. But at the same time, too, Tolbert embraced the progressives. There were young guys who came through the leadership of ULI and other organizations in the States, Charles Taylor, Bacchus Matthews, Bob Bala, and the rest of these fellas. even Tipote himself. They came from, the Union of Liberian Association leadership chairman and presidents of different associations here in the United States. They were very young, in their late 20s, early 30s, some mid to late 30s, but they were all young. And he could have been like like Tubman, to squash them off. But he brought them into the fold. He took helicopter and plane flights for them throughout the country to show his developmental projects and allowed them to register a party. The narrative also too that we read in most history books is that Chewy Party was the only party existing from, I think, the 1870s all the way to 1980. No, that's not true. There were several political parties. Even Tubman ran on the Chewy Party ticket in 1944, but he was opposed by a fellow called Cooper, who was from another party. There was the Progressive People Party that Bacchus Matthew headed that existed as far back as 1900 with William D. Coleman, who was the father of the David Coleman that Tubman killed. So, but it happened that Chewy Party ruled, continuously for 100 years. That's true. And no other party ruled. So that one party's situation had to end. And I think that's where the progressives came in. And I think Tolbert welcomed them. And in his heart, I don't think he was satisfied himself with having one party rule. So that's why he opened it up as opposed to what his predecessor Tubman did. And then the showdown of 1980 occurred. And there's a lot of undercurrent that led to 1980 that we need to cover.
But John, let me just come here a little bit. Somebody will say, just to add to some of those who are in the government, I think there was another person called Frank J. Stewart Sr., who was the director of the budget, and James T. Phillips. Yeah, I don't know whether Phillips was an additional or an American, but James Phillips was in the government too. And then John W. Sherman too, the Assistant Minister of Commerce and Trade at that time, was also in the government at that time. But the question I want to pose to you, just for clarity and for a little thought on that. So some people say, some historians say that Tolbert found himself between the sisters, between the hard and stony places. His conservatives in the Tory party felt he was going too fast, and then the progressives thought he was going too slow. So what would you say that Tolbert found himself in? Was he too fast or was he too slow with the change in Liberia?
If we look at the current situation in the United States of where President Joe Biden stands right now, and you see demonstrations throughout the United States, against Joe Biden, that he's, not in sympathy with the Palestinians. Then at the same time, you see the pro-Israeli people saying that he's anti-Israel. That's exactly where Tolbert stood. Tolbert stood between the crosshairs. He was the leader of the Chewy Party, but he was a progressive in terms of his political approach. He wasn't conservative in his political approach. He was one of those who was grassroots. He allowed the Progressive Alliance to register as the Progressive People's Party against the wishes of his Chewy Party. That's true. And that angered forces within his Chewy Party. And Tolbert was caught between the crosshairs of many forces that led to his eventual demise. And I think it was inevitable because he was between the walls of international, opposition and local opposition. Locally, he had the conservative forces of the Chewy Party against him because he allowed the Progressive People's Party to be registered, and they felt that he was a little too liberal on that end. Also within the Chewy Party, there was anger for what happened in 1979. Also, not just the rights riot, but he executed, I think, 9 individuals from Harper-Lufa County. Maryland County. The Harper 9, I believe, Alan Yancey and Daniel Anderson and the rest of them. And Daniel Anderson was the son of the Secretary General of the Chewy Party. And Alan N. Yancey was the son of the former Vice President, of Liberia, who was also a high-ranking member of the Chewy Party. And he executed him because of ritualistic killing, and He wanted to set an example that this kind of activity should not occur, and put a deterrent to that kind of stuff. And it ruffled a lot of feathers within the True Week Party. And then he came about with this liberal attitude of allowing the PPP and other progressives, to register. He even appointed a couple of them, Sam Jackson, and other folks, into the government, and allowed them the leeway to have a clear path towards participating in the impending elections that was supposed to occur, I think, within a couple of years. So they felt also too that his foreign policy was not in line with what Tubman had. So that was locally. He had strong opposition locally for these reasons. And then adding to that was the opposition from the Progressive Alliance, from Moja and PPP. So he had the opposition, crushing him, his own internal party structure crushing him, because he took these principled, stances on issues. He stood in principle against ritualistic killing. He stood in principle for the promotion of democracy, for every Liberian to have a fair opportunity and not just have True Week Party dominate the system. It was all because of principles. And then internationally, he stood on principle for the freedom of Africa, for the liberation of Southern Africa, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and all these countries that were fighting for their independence, not to even mention South Africa itself. And for that reason, he had problems with the United States in terms of foreign policy. Not only for the fact that he took that stance, but he used his leadership in OAU to launch sanctions against South Africa, to launch sanctions against Israel, which was another, a strong partner of the United States. I mean, of the Republic of Liberia. As we can remember, in 1948, Liberia cast the deciding vote in the UN to create the state of Israel. In exchange for that, President Tubman and Richard Henrys, they negotiated a lot of infrastructural benefit for the Republic of Liberia, in exchange for support to Israel. Included in that package of support was the construction of the executive mansion, the Capitol building, the Temple of Justice, Information Ministry. Israeli business interests constructed the Ducal Palace Hotel, and a lot of other visible infrastructure in Liberia that we see today that makes up the city of Monrovia. So Monrovia was modernized through that partnership with Israel. And going even further strategically, Israel transformed the Liberian frontier forces into the armed forces of Liberia. Now, much credit would go to the United States government, but no, actually it was Israel, because America had promised Tubman for so many years that they will expand the army and provide, munitions and arms to create a real national force. But it failed in doing that. And Tubman negotiated with Israel through that partnership to actually expand, the armed forces of Liberia. I mean, the frontier forces into the armed forces of Liberia. It was during that time that folks like even my late father, came in as young recruits and got trained, locally and internationally. General George T. Washington and others presided over those, that transition. So that's how strategic Israel was to Liberia. Israel protected Tubman very well with intelligence and kept him in power for 27 years. For most of the 27 years, because they came in after 1948. But when Tolbert came in, because of the Israeli invasion of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights, when they seized those territories, Egypt and other Arab League countries in Africa, Libya and the rest of them, prevailed upon the OAU to take actions against Israel. And Tolbert followed suit and severed diplomatic relationship with Israel after he took over. That angered Israel. That went against the foreign policy of the United States of America. And that began, the downward, spiral of relationship between the Tolbert administration and that of Israel, and of course, their principal ally, the United States of America.
So John, would you say that some people believe that, and I like the historical background you brought to this discussion. Would you say that Tolbert's non-aligned stance moved him to do what he did that caused a problem for his administration?
Yeah, Tolbert took a more principled and more pragmatic approach to international, foreign, and local uh, 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 in his local, policy. His stance internationally, yes, it was non-aligned. He believed that Liberia should be free as a sovereign nation, in the true sense of sovereignty, to choose their friends. So we decided that we could be friends with under his rule as opposed to that of Tubman. We could be friends with the United States and be friends with Russia at the same time. He brought the Russian embassy in to Liberia. That's something that Tubman would not do. Tubman would not expel Israel because of his action in Golan Heights and the rest of those places, because Tubman had a deal and a partnership with Israel. But Tolbert took those stances as a non-aligned leader. He was leader of the non-aligned movement. He was president of the Baptist World Alliance as a moral leader internationally. And then he became chairman of the OAU. And the OAU had a resolution, imposing sanctions against Israel. So in addition to severing diplomatic ties with Israel in 1972, he went ahead and imposed sanctions against Israel, in 1979 as a result of the OAU resolution. America had prevailed upon Tolbert to relax, these very firm international positions that he had. But, he felt that out of principle, he had to do those things. There were strategic, deals that were given, offered to him to even help or back off from supporting, the political movements, in Namibia, in Swapo and all these places, in Southwest, Africa and these areas too. But he very vigorously pursued these things against, the will of the United States, because the United States was against sanction against South Africa at that time. So United States at that time, in their position, as much as a lot of political leaders in the United States right now hail, the freedom of Nelson Mandela and all those actions that happened, 20 years ago. America, under the Republican leadership of people like Ronald Reagan and even Nixon before, was firmly against, sanctions against the United States. The United States Congress could not vote to take these kinds of positions. I'm just giving you the backdrop to the opposition and the friction that Tolbert faced internationally after we've just discussed, his local opposition in domestic troubles that he had. So all these militated towards the demise of President Tolbert in 1980. Now, people point fingers to the progressives. The only role that the progressives played in the coup was to awaken the consciousness of Liberians, towards, let's leave the rights right. It was just political propaganda, which, Tolbert could have, fought against if he had his own propaganda. They were just trying to get some political edge at that time. But mainly, the underlying reasons, for the coup, where that saying that the progressives, planned and executed the coup. I mean, that's far from any truth. They just, created a climate of opposition towards Tolbert that was exploited by other forces that were bigger than they. According to narratives, even from Tolbert's wife, the coup was not really executed by Samuel Doe, planned and executed by Samuel Doe and the 17 men of the Chewy Party. The coup was, in essence, executed by external forces, and Samuel Doe and the rest of them were put in place, to go, to pick up the pieces after it happened. So, and it was as a result of the very things that we're discussing right now, the friction that existed between Tolbert, his international, Liberia traditional international partners like America, Israel, and even South Africa, that was in partnership with America and Israel. So it's a complicated web of intrigue that led to Tolbert's downfall.
John,
Yeah.
Some political commentators and observers would say, in terms of the progressives' interaction with the late President Tolbert, the reason why they blame the progressives, or not maybe directly, but was because of the arrest of backup progressives that led to Tolbert's undoing. What would you say to that?
Well, the arrest of Bacchus Matthews and the rest of the progressives in 1980, uh, yes, it was a precursor to the coup, but it just created a further ground for what would happen and what would be done by forces that were already in motion. Um, we understand, through the narratives given by a former member of the True Party regime, that uh, the neocons within the True Party, they pressured Tolbert to go ahead and put these progressives in jail, to teach them a lesson or whatever, and that provided a conducive climate for what was to eventually happen. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the progressive planned and executed a coup. But
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
happens to the progressive laid a further ground for the forces that were already in action.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
have been hearing about how the coup or the assassination was done by a foreign hand, and some people point at America, the United States, uh, and they gave the rationale that because President Tolbert was a non-aligned president, not siding with the United States at the time, was the precursor to get rid of him, and the United States government sought they exploited the agitation and the tension brought to the fore by the progressives to get rid of him and then install somebody or someone who they could pretty much have control over. That's what I've been hearing, but I haven't seen any ironclad evidence to substantiate that particular claim. Um, what makes you confident to think that it was an external force that executed the former President Tolbert?
Well, from conversations I had with my late father, who was a top military officer and part of the security forces, and other, and as a journalist, from conversation I had with other former members of the security forces of Liberia, whether they work in the military or other external forces, and from my experience internationally, there's clear indication that Samuel Doe, Sergeant Doe, Corporal Wessian, and Staff Sergeant Thomas Wessian, a few of them, had the resources, the intricate know-how to plan and execute a coup d'etat that would dethrone the chairman of the Organization of African Unity, who even has some very strong, defense support from Guinea and other places. Uh, there's no ironclad evidence to say that it was the United States of America. That's true.
Mhm. Yeah.
Uh, America was not the only a strong elephant abroad that Tubble ruffled. Tubble ruffled Israel, as I said. Tubble ruffled South Africa. And of course, he brought discomfort to the United States of America. So any of these external forces could have done it,
Yeah.
but it was certainly not done from an
John, you're
internal
right, though. You're
standpoint.
right,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
yeah, according to, I mean, there are different accounts of this assassination of the late President Tolbert. But one account has it that the group entered the executive mansion in the presidential palace and killed the president. Of course, whose body was done in a mass grave with 27 others on Center Street there.
Yeah.
But it is reported that Harrison Penner was the person who shot and killed the president. That's why, but accounts differ for different from person to person. In his book, The Marks of Anarchy, Stephen Ellis claimed that the president was found sleeping in his office where those men shot and killed him. But Ellen Johnson's book, titled "This Child Will Be Great," says Toba was killed in his bed. So we don't really know what really happened from these different accounts that we're hearing.
Well,
Uh,
well, according to accounts from Tolbert's own family,
uh-huh.
and I spoke with multiple members of Tolbert family. Tolbert was not in bed. Tolbert was
Okay.
awake. I saw Tolbert the night before he was executed. I mean, and assassinated, not executed. I attended the 100-year anniversary event of the Baptist World Alliance. At the time of Tolbert execution, he was president of the Baptist World Alliance. The entire Baptist World Compact had gathered in Monrovia for a conference similar to OAU. They were even using the villas and all that. My father, who was a Baptist minister, were part of the convention that was hosting this particular event that weekend. So you had top leaders, pastors, and convention heads from all over the world in Liberia at that time. They had a concert at the Centennial Memorial Pavilion, which I did attend along with my siblings that night. And Tolbert spoke at that concert, and I even stood by his car, just to see the president when he was going to his car and waved to him. And I stood probably about 5 feet away from him as he entered his car. I saw him that night. Okay, it was close. It was just maybe an hour and a half before he got killed when he left the Centennial Pavilion, and we saw him that night. Although he prophetically said that night when he spoke to us that 100 years ago, none of us existed. I'm paraphrasing, but it's close to what he said. And 100 years from now, none of us will exist. That's how long this convention has lasted. 100 years will not exist, and some of us, who knows, tomorrow we may not even exist.
Mhm.
He prophetically said that even tomorrow, some of us may not be here. And then an hour and a half later, he was killed. I don't think he was asleep an hour and a half after that.
But you
So
can be in bed and not asleep, John. That said he was in bed.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but then I spoke. I read his wife's book, and I spoke with
Yeah.
family members who corroborated the fact that he was in his suite, and the suite was a bunker, a bulletproof bunker that they couldn't penetrate. But then his wife was in the other suite that was not as heavily protected. And when they couldn't enter his suite, they went to his wife's suite, and they threatened that if he does not come out, they would enter the suite of his wife and his children and grandchildren.
That's
And
what she said. That's what that was
well, that's
Victoria
what
said.
family members said.
Oh, okay.
And when he opened the door, they shot him point blank. It wasn't Harrison Bennett.
Okay.
According to them, it were foreign. It was a foreign squad that did that. Yeah.
Okay, but you see, when that took place, people were jubilating because they wanted
Yeah.
to change, and those regime initially promised reforms and a return to civilian rule, but soon that government became characterized by its own brand of authoritarianism, or a kind of a authoritarianism. That's what I wanted to say. Human
Yeah.
rights abuses and also corruption. Okay, now, and then later on, things started to go down, the drain.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the whole country. Now, from your own lifetime, seeing what went on and looking at what occurred in the history of that country that was so ghastly somehow,
Yeah.
and up to now, the Civil War came, and then the war, a lot of people died, and we're having this transition of democracy from the to the current administration. What are some of the takeaways for those who are listening right now with all the tumultuous events that went on in history between the 70s, the 80s, and then the Civil War, or Samuel passed away, was killed, and then the Civil War, and now we're seeing this democracy or ingredients of democracy working gradually now. What are some of the takeaways so far for you that you can share?
Yeah. It's regrettable that the country longed to have an open system of free democracy where there could be equal opportunity, within the political and economic sphere for all. And that's what the progressives agitated for. And then a coup occurred in 1980, which brought the very progressives to power through, the PRC. But then not too soon, not quite soon after that coup. Um, Within a year after that, a majority of the progressives were out of the system because a lot of them did have affiliation, with Eastern forces, and a lot of them did not have those kind of affiliation either. But as it is within many other African countries, and the same occurred in Ghana, Nigeria, and everywhere else where the neo-colonialist, balkanization occurred. Samuel Doe and the PRC got overtaken by the same forces that destroyed Ghana and Nigeria and the rest of these places where puppets were empowered to carry out the will of external economic powers, and we got caught between the crosshairs of the Cold War. We became a casualty of the Cold War, where Samuel Doe was entrenched in power to carry out the agenda of winning the Cold War. And the focus was not on these, ideals that were, professed and what people thought would occur as a result of the removal of Tolbert. I mean, first of all, the manner in which the Tolbert government was removed was not the kind of, change that we wanted, even though we wanted democracy, but not in that kind of brutal manner that, introduced a culture of violence, and destruction to our nation, executing people, bringing about, ethnic divide and all that kind of a spiral. It's disappointing also that those who, drew up a list to execute people for rampant corruption, misuse of public office, and violation of human rights came and violated people's rights. They came about and carried out destruction far exceeded what the True Party did. Individuals who claimed to be heroes came out to be point blank rogues within the system. And members of the various ethnic groups from one to another have assumed power, and whenever they assume power, it's not for the benefit of the rest of the tribe, but only their own tribe. So it makes one to wonder, what is the difference between having a True Party America ruling, as opposed to a Bassa or a Crew ruling?
Yeah.
Because when any of these tribes get there, they just seek their own. What is the benefit of the Crew man when a man from Nimba or Lofa is in power? When they're only going to benefit the people from their own tribe. So it makes no difference as to whether you have someone from the American ethnic group or from the Crown ethnic group, because any one of these ethnic groups will come and only seek the interests of their own. And that's a sad reality of what has happened to Liberia. And then the situation between 1980 to 1989 with, the True Party and the transition, of the Samuel Doe government, from PRC to the INA to the NDPL, government, was sad because it happened undemocratically, with the election of 1985. And then, the purging of people from Nimba County, after the coup situation.
Yeah.
And then the war, the very agitators of the war in 1990, who came to free us, quote unquote, from Samuel Doe, turned out to be villains. No different from, how the PRC came to liberate us from, the TWP, the True Party in 1980, and they turned out to be villains.
Yeah.
So everyone has come to take their piece of the pie and transform Liberia into a big elephant meat where everyone would cut until, we have reached to the bare bones.
Wow. It's like a vicious circle.
Yes, it's a vicious cycle. It's sad.
Yeah. So where are we heading now?
Go ahead. Let's go ahead.
No, I was asking. So now looking at our country, where are we heading? I know we are talking about the 70s and the 80s, but looking at your from your own perspective right now, are we heading in the right direction, or it is still early to tell?
Well, there have been gains and there have been losses. There have been multiple losses. The country has lost tremendously. We're discussing 40 years ago. 40 years is a very long time. It's almost close to half of a century. Our country has not progressed. It has only retrogressed. We have only gone backwards. We go back home and People talk about normal days, how Liberia was so, better off 40 years ago, half a century ago. Right now, it's about 44 years now. Okay.
Wow.
We could have been 45 years ahead, but now we are 40, actually 44 years behind. That's extremely pathetic. Um, and what has been the reason for this? We had the instability in the aftermath of 1980, then the war for another 14 years. We had transition, but the occurrences of those years, the 10 years plus the 14 years, 24 years, it destroyed our economy, it destroyed our social systems, it destroyed our values, scattered our best resources around the world, brain drain. You have, educated men like, Reverend Suah S, Dr. Alex Red, myself, and the rest, all abroad,
Mhm.
giving our human resources to elsewhere when Liberia could be benefiting. And we have tens of thousands of others out there, So the brain drain, the economic drain has hurt our country greatly, but all is not lost. The only gain that I've seen that have come out of this is the free space of democracy that it has created. We have a country where we can honestly say, regardless of all the backwardness, that we have a democratic system where one group of people, we cannot say one group of people are dominating the political sphere. You know, any Liberian can aspire for political office and have the opportunity to gain a space if it's the will of the people. But then again, we also have to, look at how the will of the people have been exercised in the choices that have been made.
Mhm.
Whether the environment has provided enough education and information to our people to make the right choices. And as long as our people remain, uninformed, uh, they become economically starved. How can we, examine or evaluate the choices that they make? I know there was a previous show that I spoke on where we talk about Liberians having the Stockholm syndrome, where they get comfortable with the exploitation of their abusers. And in spite of democracy, these realities are occurring in Liberia as we speak today. People are exercising free choice and electing who they want to elect. But at the same time, people who pillage the resources of our country are being elected to the Senate
Mm.
because they have a few change in their hands. And people are starved. So therefore, they get the vote of these starved people. So we have the semblance of democracy where people make free choice. But is it actually a free choice? When people are starving, and because they are starving, they tend to vote for people who are villains.
Yeah.
Is it real democracy when people are left uneducated and uninformed and make the wrong choices? But actually, it's the choice of the people. These are the realities of the democracy that we face right now. Are we better off today? No, because we could have been far ahead of where we should have been.
Yeah, that's a lot that we we just covered, and we are out of time here. Reverend Deddeh, I know his screen is kind of frozen. Are you there, Reverend Deddeh?
I'm here.
Okay, and for those who are just coming, we are talking about President Tolbert and the
I'm here.
Progressives,
I'm
the
here.
70s and the 80s. Yes, do you wanted to say something before we close the program?
Yes, I think he commented on that, but the point I wanted to make was that he just gave a little inch of window, bird's eye into the Dose regime. That is another big discussion by itself, and I don't think we can start a discussion and finish it today. So now John is telling us indirectly that we will also go to the Dose regime and discuss and see what happened during that time. Because my concern, and John hit the nail on his head. The goal that liberators should not rule. That's was the team in Liberia where Dole came into power, and he didn't like that at all. So we look at the history. to be able to guard ourselves by the history we've seen so far that we know about, so that we don't make the same errors and the same mistake. But one thing remains constant is that Liberians, I'm sorry to say, we celebrate people who treat the country bad. And that's what John was alluding to. People who we know that have done things that are not right. And these very people are elected into offices and they make laws for the nation that they've corrupted. So this is something Liberians will really have to look at and examine themselves and re-examine themselves or cross-examine themselves to try not to be making the same error over and over again. My next point will soon be closing is this. The leaders of today should look at the history of yesterday so that they guard themselves and pray for wisdom so that they don't go back to what brought us to this point. And this is the purpose for this discussion, John and Alex, so that people see where we've come from, or the errors that were made along the way. There were good intentions along the way, but there was also intentional bad behavior by our leaders and those who supported our leaders, John and Alex. There are people who will be in government who have their own fish to fry, who have their own things to do. So they bring their issues in the government and mislead the leadership to the direction they want to go. And that happened to Doe. We heard that the progressives who were in government also had their own things to do, and they quote unquote misled Doe. I don't know how true is that. Maybe John can relate to that another time, but they misled him because they have their own mindset about government, about governance. So Doe being Ingrid Ramos, when they first came into power, maybe listened to them, and maybe that led to where Doe found himself. But it could be wrong or true. But let me
it's a fact. Majority of the progressives were inexperienced.
Yeah.
Majority of the so-called progressives, they were young and inexperienced. It was easier to launch propaganda against experienced folks like Tolbert. But when the power were given to them, they were not responsible enough to handle this power. They gave bad advice to Samuel Doe, for example. Chair Chibo admitted to the fact that they told Doe and the PRC to go and raid their central bank, and they got hundreds of thousands of dollars cash from there and divided it with the PRC people and took some for themselves. I mean, how can you talk against the True Party government a few months before about corruption, execute people, and then get in there and just pillage the national bank coffers? I mean, I hear people criticizing George Weah for, taking container of cash. But I mean, based on what happened in 1980 when the central bank was raided like that, we can't say that George Weah situation didn't have a precedent. He wasn't the first to do it. So these actions that occur in modern times, are actions, that were done before. That others laid the foundation for what other corrupt government officials are copying now, and it's just that kind of bad direction we are taking within the last, half a century that has destroyed our country. We don't know who to trust. People come as political agitators and opposition and say one thing, and when they get empowered, they do the opposite. It's just they say what they have to say to get in power, only to turn around and go ahead and pillage the national resources when they get there. There's no sense of consciousness of nationalhood, of patriotism, of love of country. There's no agenda, there, for taking over power other than to have, a seat at the table to enrich oneself. And it's sad, what we have seen before our own eyes, within previous governments, and even currently, in the sense of certain government officials, we are watching the asset recovery effort that the government is making right now, and we're seeing how people just took government, resources and government property, and they did it corruptly and with legal backing. I mean, I applaud. The current president, boycott for some of the actions he's taking. I think he has a genuine heart against corruption. The fact that he's going after these assets and trying, to get justice in certain areas. But I think the path towards, straightening up the country is much more than, just taking these good actions that he's taking. There has to be a comprehensive system put in place. There has to be a comprehensive policy laid out for sustained and durable, change in the future. And it would take a lot more sophisticated action than what we're seeing now.
Indeed,
That is
indeed.
why it's important that we discuss history so that we don't go back to where we came from. Well, Alex.
Exactly.
Exactly. And that's why when we look at our history, all that has been going on, it is all about wrong leadership, heading the wrong way, and lack of love for one another, and lack of love for country. And that's why we are missing our country. And hopefully we can be, agents of change to effect the kind of changes that we'd like to see in attitudes and behaviors. And hopefully the younger generation will catch up as well, because our history is replete with bloodletting. And um and I am elated in my spirit through prayer, not just for me but prayer from other Christian leaders and other faith communities in our country, um, looking forward to seeing a brighter day, a brighter day where we can argue, but we can't take gun or knife to stab or shoot each other. We can go to the courts. We just hope that we'll have a good justice system, and it is a good thing or starting point where we have an economic crime court where people will be brought to justice for embezzlement. We'll see now people who have done wrong or hurt other people. We have a court for that. And I believe that we can see such court as a deterrence to those who um, live their entire life or feast on seeing the blood of other people. In our country, we have people who are on the ready, or they are ready to get rid of people. We have seen it in recent times where we see politically motivated murders, also the human being parts been taken away, ritualistic killing, and we see lack of integrity both in the government and even in the church. We see the proliferation of churches. We see that the poor people are being exploited by so-called gospel preachers. They twist the gospel for their own personal gain. And so if we look at the social fabric of our country and look at our culture now, there's a lot of work that we all have to do. It takes prayer, but it also takes action. We have to step up to the plate in every way that we can help. If you can help, if I can help, and anybody else, doesn't matter the distance, but we have to step up and stop all of the insecurity and all of the draining down of the culture, and also draining down of love, lack of love for one another as Liberians. We need to restore our identity to our country. All right. This is how we leave you today on the podcast. We'd like to thank you so much for coming in today as our special guest, Mr. John Lloyd. Thank you so much. I know you had a busy schedule, but we appreciate the fact that you were able to make it here, and you share a whole lot of knowledge with us. There's a lot that I learned as well, because I was almost like a baby, young at the time when that incident took place.
So are you saying John is far older than you?
but those events.
Why you want to treat John like that,
man? Even though you still look young in the face, but that's honest John. So, but he said a whole lot about the nuances, the politics in between, the mobilization of the progressives, the agitation between the Tolbert government and the and those social groups or political groups. So there's a lot we learn, and I believe that all our watching audience learn a whole lot too. But we'll carry on the discussion in our next podcast. And so please be our guest every time. Share this link with your friends, your families, and your loved ones so that they can be a part of this podcast. And we appreciate you. Until then, we'll be back here. Thank you, Mr. Laura.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Call upon you again to come and share with our audience here.
John, God, you and partner, Lord.
Yes.
Okay, you pronounced God went right this time.
Yeah, I know. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
brother.
And
Thank
may
you.
you have a blessed weekend.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next Saturday, the same time at 6:30 Eastern Time.